So today's dialogue is English mostly, co-creating plurilingual classroom policies. And the presenter, the subject matter experts are Rebecca Schmor, MED, and Serikbolsyn Tastanbek, MA. And I'm your host. And the moderator is Melita Vrakela, OCELT. Feel free to, once we start, I just want to talk about the subject matter experts, and then after the subject matter expert answers your the questions, then feel free to participate and in the dialogues. So Rebecca Schmor, she, her, is an English for academic purposes instructor, graduate research assistant, and PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. She has taught and conducted research with higher education institutions, ministries of education, and private language schools in Canada, China, Cuba, Germany, and Italy. Her main research interests center around inclusive language education and plurilingual teacher identity. Our other subject matter expert is Serikbolsyn Tastanbek, who is a PhD student in teaching English as a second language at the University of British Columbia. As a TESL professional, he works in teacher education, drawing on his experience of teaching English for general, academic, and specific purposes in Kazakhstan and Canada. As a critical applied linguist, he investigates language ideologies, identities, translanguaging, and critical plurilingual pedagogy. Sorry about that. As an activist, he engages in dialogue with fellow TESL professionals to demystify graduate school and to promote critical praxis. Through his work, Serikbolsyn hopes to contribute to making TESL and particularly teacher education more socially just.
Phew. That's a long wonderful.
Okay, so we'll have introductory questions, and then we have conversation and discussion questions, and then we'll finish with the breakout room activities and discussion at the end. So the introductory questions, the question number 1 to the subject matters is: how would you describe monolingual and plurilingual teaching practices? And how did you move from English only to English mostly in your teaching? So Rebecca or Serikbolsyn, whoever wants to answer the question.
Great, yeah, I'll get us started just with the first one, and then I'll hand it off to Serikbolsyn. Also, hello and welcome. Happy to be here with you tonight, if it is evening, wherever you are. Yeah, so we did want to start with just a conversation a bit about these terms, which you've probably heard of: monolingual, and maybe you've heard of plurilingual. You've probably heard of multilingual. So there's a lot of terms that we use, of course, sometimes interchangeably, sometimes we do assign different meanings depending on our background. So from my experience as a teacher and researcher, when I think of monolingual, I immediately think of the English only policies. I teach in English for academic purposes, so I also think of English medium instruction, but specifically in a way where learners are discouraged from using any other language other than English. So those are some of that's how I define monolingualism as a term. And then if I think of different examples of what that looks like in classrooms, I might think of some practices like, discouraging translation, telling students, just to think only in English, not to make connections to other languages. I have also encountered different examples of practices like maybe punishing students for using a language other than English. And I'm thinking of things like telling students to put money in a jar or giving them a strike for each time they're heard speaking a different language. So these practices are still used as far as I've heard in recent years. Plurilingual, when I think of this term, I start thinking of instructional practices that that first of all recognize multiple languages. So of course there is a target language in our context, it's English, but there's a recognition and an appreciation of linguistic diversity. And also importantly, I think plurilingual approaches view linguistic diversity as an asset. So other languages are something that we can draw on as teachers, as learners in the learning process. So language as resource. Examples of this, I can think of for my own, in my own teaching, for example, things like making connections across languages, either, lexical items or maybe grammar structures. Whether I have, knowledge of my students' languages or not, I am familiar with different ways that myself or other instructors can incorporate them to make those comparisons. And we can talk more about that probably in our other activities today. A couple other examples might be something that in my research I've encountered. It's called mother tongue mediation, which basically is something like maybe reading something in one language and then discussing it in another language, which are things that people who use multiple languages tend to do anyways in their daily lives. You might, read a news article and then call your mom and talk about it in different languages. So those are practices that can happen in the classroom as well. And then one final example before I hand it off to Serikbolsyn would be any sort of activities that kind of display or also value and affirm different communication practices. So whether it's showing a variety of accents in the English language or in any language, or even something like in classrooms I've had discussions with students about gestures and how those are different across different cultures and languages. So anything that sort of brings in that diversity in instruction. So that's my take on those two terms, monolingual and plurilingual, and I'll hand it off to Serikbolsyn.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for getting us started. And again, as Rebecca highlighted, there are different terms that we use to discuss like different practices in teaching English. And in my case, I usually refer to monolingual practices as well as plurilingual practices or translingual practices. But in essence, the second type refers to the more inclusive approaches to teaching English as an additional language. So I would like to give some examples or maybe descriptions of what these practices represent to me. So if I were to talk about monolingual teaching practices, I think that when those practices are employed by teachers, there is an assumption that English is a neutral language that should be taught according to its standard form, whatever the standard is about. For example, if the teacher is located in Canada, then Canadian English is the standard, right? But if it's something that's taught in the context of the UK, maybe a specific type of English there is the standard. But so there's no problematization of what that standard means, or there's no acknowledgement of varieties in English, even among the standards, right? Like we don't really talk about that when we are taking a monolingual approach. And that means that there is no problematization of established norms in teaching standard English, which are typically associated with the privileged social groups in the context, right? So who do we aspire to be like? We look at people on TV and in our society who speak a specific standard form of English, and we want our students to be like them for socioeconomic gains and other things. So it means that there's also this lack of critical reflection related to assumptions and how the teachers benefit from those norms, right? Considering where they come from and how they learned English and how they have been teaching English for long. So there's a lot of hidden assumptions related to teaching the standard form of English, in other words. And as a result, of course, often racialized multilingual students are restricted in their development of English as an additional language because they think that there's only one way to speak English that is correct, and they often feel guilt related to their own form of English, right? If they come from places where English is also their first language, but they are marginalized for the way of speaking. Let's say if they've come from the Caribbean or from India, they think that their accent is like marked, and for that reason, they don't feel good about their English, and they feel like they need to emulate the standard English. And if I were to give a personal example, for instance, when I was just starting my career as a teacher, I tried my best to follow the norms in teaching English because I wanted to gain legitimacy as a teacher and authority, right? Because I wanted to be respected by my students. And for that reason, I tried to conceal all or any forms of accent that I had that might seem not neutral. And I definitely enforced an English-only rule in my classroom. So whenever my students ask me something in our shared languages, I would say, "Hey, speak English," you know, and without much critical reflection because of that, I think I was using teaching resources from established publishing houses. I won't name names, but you know them. And those textbooks usually do not really integrate any content relevant to our students' languages or cultures, right? So there's only this like standard form of culture. Usually we talk about Big Bang, some other things like in York, the Statue of Liberty. So those standard things, and then students, of course, are socialized into those norms as a result. I also relied on plurilingual and translingual teaching approaches only as a crutch. So I did rely on those resources, of course, but I was convinced that my students couldn't follow the norms in such cases. So that's why I thought that I should rely on those resources. And of course, I did feel guilty because of that, right? Because I was doing something forbidden. And in contrast, when teachers align more with plurilingual or translingual teaching practices, they tend to acknowledge that teaching English is a political act associated with specific forms of English, right? And it requires critical and holistic engagement with the target language, which is English in our case, and also engagement with our students' multilingual repertoires as something legitimate and as something that needs to be treated as a resource, right? And in case teachers identify as white and monolingual, such approaches or plurilingual approaches require decentering their experiences, because often their experiences of learning and teaching English are not the same as our students, right? So we need to understand that we cannot teach our students the way we learned English, because our context of learning and teaching is so different from theirs, right? And as a result, we need to center our students' experiences and what we need to consider in their development of English as an additional language. And if teachers are racialized and multilingual, it doesn't mean automatically that they're inclusive, right? So it means that such teachers need to practice solidarity and make sure that students can harness their linguistic and cultural resources in learning, because even racialized teachers tend to experience internalized racism in relation to teaching English, and they think that they also need to abide by norms and teach the standard form of English. So there is a need for critical reflection among all kinds of teachers, no matter what their race and other affiliations are. So if I were to give a personal example here again, when I worked in Kazakhstan, I shared a similar linguistic and cultural repertoire as my students. And harnessing our similarities, I used to strategically use translingual teaching practices to scaffold their writing, for example, in EAP. For instance, I encouraged my students to use multilingual sources, for example, in English, as well as Russian and Kazakh, to develop their multilingual outlines. So I wanted them to develop outlines that are contextually relevant, which aren't just about or based on resources that come from the West, but also something from our context, right? And also in developing these outlines, we worked on translingual paraphrasing and drafting the stages of the problem solution genre together. So they were free to brainstorm and write however they want in some sort of free writing, you know, they were free to employ their holistic repertoire in doing that. And currently I work with international students who do not really share the same linguistic and cultural background as me. So as you see, even as a multilingual teacher and teacher educator, I work with so many different students, and it's not the same. Your teaching needs to be contextual, right? In this case, we co-constructed, like this term, for example, we co-constructed the classroom language policy at the beginning of the course. And in this case, again, I did not assume that they would be all on board with the inclusive language policies. I asked what they are comfortable with, and we together negotiated the policy, right? So we created a set of rules that we would follow together. So in the beginning, the list consisted of monolingual and plurilingual rules, and then we discussed those rules together before setting the rules that work for most of us. During the course, I rely a lot on peer support because I don't know all the languages in the classroom, obviously, as well as digital affordances such as translators or interpreters and multilingual resources that the students can use. So, and a quick general reflection, I think, although I'm using the dichotomy of white monolingual versus racialized multilingual teachers to simplify my examples, I want to acknowledge that our identities and experiences of privilege and oppression are intersectional. So even racialized teachers experience a lot of privilege because we have access to the standard forms of English typically, right? And considering that, considering our intricately intersecting identities, I think we all need to critically reflect on our positions or positionality in the context of TESL, and we need to engage with teaching English as an additional language critically. Thank you so much for listening. Yeah.
So much to digest, so much information. Thank you so much. Ironically, with the idea of accent, I had a student approach me today and he said, Melita, you know, I want to speak English like you do. And I said, that's impossible, blah, blah, blah. You have an accent. He says, how do I get rid of it? And I said, your accent is what makes this country, the English language, so beautiful. Why would you want to get rid of that? You bring up some very, very great points. Should we go on to the next one, Karolina?
Yes, the other question, I don't think we talked too much about this. How did you move from English only to English mostly in your teaching?
Great. So yeah, I'll jump back in and share a little bit more of my story, I guess. So this English only policy, I think that I've experienced in different ways. I've experienced it very officially and also non-officially in different institutions that I've worked at. So when I think about how I sort of started to move away from it, it feels like something that happened quite naturally, and it happened from, I guess, a little bit of reflection on my experiences, but also just in the moment. Me and Karolina were chatting a bit before you all joined about some of my early teaching experiences where there were classrooms. I was teaching general English to beginner students, and we shared languages in our repertoire. So there was Spanish there was Portuguese, and we were able to just help each other. So as some of you may be familiar with teaching, you know, beginner levels, it's I only did it for a few months, I have to say, and it was very challenging to find, you know, vocabulary in common sometimes. Even as Karolina was mentioning before, just explaining instructions can be sometimes challenging at that level. Unless you draw on different linguistic resources. And so that's something that just happened very naturally with my learners, but it happened in a school where we had English only signs all over the walls in the hallways. And that obviously posed a bit of a, I don't know if a challenge, but it was definitely a tension. And so for me, moving from English only, which was the kind of mandated expectation in my context, to practices where I was, you know, code switching with students, and obviously the target language was always English, and that's why I think we've titled our session English Mostly, because for me at least, moving away from English only has never meant, you know, no English at all. It's always plurilingual perspectives for me, again, are always about developing your language repertoire. So that can mean English, but not only. So that's, again, something that happened pretty naturally for me. And it's something that happened in a way that kind of validated my own experiences as a language learner as well, not only in teaching, but I'm aware of how I've learned languages and the tools that have helped me. Some of the languages in my repertoire are French, that I learned a bit earlier on in Canada, and then Spanish, Italian, some German, Portuguese by way of some of the Romance languages that I already have. So making those connections, building on what I already knew, was something that happened naturally, and also made it easier for me to learn languages. So that's something I already knew intrinsically that felt right. And so obviously for me, it felt wrong to like cut off those connections for learners. And even, for example, we were also having a little conversation about this before the others joined. So technology as a resource as well. Of course, there are views of teaching that maybe discourage translation and discourage using Google Translate, let's say. But for me, that's what has always worked for myself, to just have, get a quick, understand the meaning quickly of something. And instead of learning a concept by way of multiple words or phrases to try to understand a word for word concept that I'm already familiar with, a word for word translation in my case has been really helpful to expand my language knowledge in multiple languages. So yeah, all that to say that my early teaching experiences were kind of nestled in this tension and a little bit of resistance. One other thing was being exposed to literature on plurilingualism. Theories can be great. If they're not practiced, they don't serve us very much. But that was something that helped me as well. And I'm happy to share resources if anyone's looking for a good read for the winter, perhaps. And then finally, experimentation. So that's where, with this combination of my own, sort of intuition, I guess, some scholarly sources and literature, and then being able to actually put those theories into practice in class. One of the ways I did it at the beginning was just through icebreakers, because my curriculum has always been very set. I was able to incorporate kind of micro plurilingual activities, which still had, I would say, not a micro effect. I could see quite a strong impact of those. And I think we will definitely discuss activities in our breakout session as well. Yeah, so being able to see how these practices let learners just feel, that like all of them, the fullness of their linguistic and cultural lives and identities were welcome. I saw learners open up, feel open to express themselves, and this ultimately improved their learning experience and just community building and comfort in the classes. So I'll leave it there for now, and we'll hear a bit more of Serikbolsyn's story.
Is there anything else, Serikbolsyn, you want to add to
Yeah.
it, or I can go to the next question?
So I would, of course, like to answer this question too. So here I would like to highlight a few things related to my realizations, struggles, some influences, as well as continuous reflection, which is instrumental to my growth as an English teacher. So first of all, I realized pretty quickly that English only doesn't work for me because my teaching career started in a highly multilingual context where I speak the same languages as my students. And the similarities, as well as my students' status as emerging multilinguals, were considerable reasons for employing our shared repertoires. And so it was instinctive, I understood quickly that I need to draw on these resources. And of course, there were some struggles in the process of drawing on these resources, because initially I really found it challenging to embrace this shift from English only to English mostly. But gradually, I think that I'm going from simply allowing my students to engage in multilingual practices to actually encouraging them and empowering them to use these linguistic and cultural resources in learning English as an additional language. And such journey or shift requires a lot of work, for example, related to overcoming these feelings of guilt associated with using not English only, right? And some of the influences in this journey would be my master's program, during which I started reflecting a lot more regarding such critical approaches to teaching and embracing approaches like translingual pedagogies or plurilingual pedagogies. And that program included a lot of exposure to research on critical applied linguistics, multilingual education, and TESL in general. And again, I'm also happy to share some resources just like Rebecca. I think, again, theory is really helpful, but theory alone is not enough, because there should be some reflection on your part as a teacher, right? How is that theory relevant to your practice, to your context? Because in teaching, we need to think of the needs of our students and our teaching and learning context, and the restraints under which we need to operate as teachers, right? Because administrators may not really be happy with the ideas that you have regarding critical scholarship, whatever that means, because in many cases, our students come to Canada or other contexts because of the English environment, or because they want to be exposed to standard English or some other forms of educational experiences, right? And that's why I think that it's very critical for us to continuously reflect, and this ongoing engagement in critical reflection, despite some occasional feelings of guilt or incompetence for me, it's very critical for me. And I think that also my commitment to improving students' learning of English as an additional language is a big thing, and I want to always consider their linguistic and cultural repertoires as well as socio-emotional well-being in my teaching. And one last thing, two things, sorry. So I think that, again, as I told earlier, applying this theory in practice is important, and I try to do that through action research or classroom-based research in my own teaching, right? As well as continuous conversations with fellow TESL professionals. And that happens usually through such webinars, as well as in the context of teacher education courses where I act as a teaching assistant or as an instructor. So it's important to understand the different shapes and ways of engaging in critical pedagogy in different contexts, because our teaching experiences are not universal, right? And each teacher approaches critical pedagogy or plurilingual pedagogies in different ways, depending on the different contextual factors. On that note, I want to end my part. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. Let's get to some conversation questions, right, Karolina?
Yes, it's time.
Automation.
We have to move on. We will run out of
Yes.
time. Okay, so the first conversation discussion question is: how are official and non-official English-only policies enforced in your teaching context?
Perhaps we could get the subject matter experts to chime in.
Rebecca or
Yeah, I can give a little example. So one of the ways I was mentioning before, I would say I'm happy that I work in a program where there's not an official English only policy, but for me, the curriculum is what enforces using using only English, unless maybe the instructor uses mostly English or brings in some other sorts of linguistic resources. But one other way that I think these policies are enforced in my teaching context is also through different beliefs of instructors and learners. So I have had resistance even from learners who maybe told me that, oh, I need to think only in English, and it's something they've heard a lot. And I can remember one learner in particular who spoke French, and over the course of even just a couple days, I think I encouraged this learner to make a connection between an English word and a French word. There's so many connections to be made. And the learner first said, like, no, I need to speak only in English. And then a couple days came back to class and said, oh, guess what? I learned that in French, the word, I think it was avocat, means like lawyer, and advocacy and avocado. And I was like, that's amazing. So this was a little an example of how I think even learners sort of enforce these policies, but we did want to hear, if there were sort of official policies that people are experiencing or more non-official policies of English only.
Yeah, that's interesting. So in many countries, I think there's this implicit expectation to use English only because of the institution's marketing or brand in general, right? Because they are marketed as English only or English speaking institutions, and the students kind of expect the institution to be in English only, or the parents expect that from the institution and so on. So there are a lot of social expectations, I think. So even though it's not explicitly articulated in any documents, the students tend to be put in such context, basically, yeah, like in my context. And also like teaching materials, right? They tend to be in English only. I think Brian has something to share.
Yeah, I've worked in different situations where there was a rule about English only, or that rule was not strictly enforced. And I've often wondered if it doesn't aid some learning styles and harm other learning styles. Some people learn better when it's enforced that they have to think and talk and communicate only in English. Some students need support in their own language. I worked in a French community college, and most of my students were Francophone West Africans. And sometimes they would get stuck, and I would explain something in French, and then they would say, "Oh, I see, I get it. Okay, that's good." And then we move on. So sometimes I think that second language can be beneficial. And so I'm not sure if a strict rule about English only is always the best policy.
Thanks,
Thank
Brian.
you
Thanks
so
for
much
sharing.
that.
Yeah. Elizabeth?
I'm just going to quickly chime in and say something that's fairly quick, but some of my learners actually don't want to use their first language. They don't want to because they're like, I need to learn only in English because then I'm going to be translating and I have to learn it exactly in an English context. So I find that they've made their own policy of being very, very strict in using
really good
the
point.
language that's being learned. So it's not really the institution, it's themselves. I don't know if anybody's ever found that they want to just stick in the language that's being learned and try not to translate over.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I just wanted to quickly respond to that. And as I said, in my context, we negotiate the classroom language policy with the students. So you cannot just impose whatever inclusive policy is, right? You have to make sure that the students are actually on the same page with you. And even the transition to more inclusive practices needs to be gradual. You cannot just like have this whiplash moment, So that's why I think I really like the answer or the contextualization from Elizabeth. Thank you so much.
We've got Harmony as well. Hi, Harmony.
Hello, everyone. So I'm not currently teaching ESL, or English as an other language, but I did used to teach Chinese students online during the pandemic. So in this case, it would be myself and just a handful of students, maybe a handful of kids or a handful of adults. And this would be done virtually, like what we're doing now. And technically, they did have an English only policy, and we were told, teachers were told that we would be watched, like everything is being recorded. So there is that. But actually, in actual practice, perhaps because I didn't share an exact L1 with these students, they spoke Putonghua, I spoke Cantonese. But I did at least have some sense of where they were coming from. So I did find that some degree of maybe shifting to more of an English mostly model actually helped because it helped build a rapport. And it also allowed perhaps code switching that would actually happen in a really realistic context, right? So for example, if the student wants to say what their favorite food is, it would be perfectly fine for them to say, my favorite food is baozi, as opposed to my favorite food is buns. Like it's not that big of a difference, and it allows them to share parts of their culture to whoever they end up speaking English to. And I eventually found that actually the school seemed to maybe realize what I was doing and just sort of turn a blind eye to that. So I never ran into any issues with it.
Thank you so much for sharing. I'll get to you in a minute, Derek. Just want to go over the chat. Jenny had something interesting. She said, one policy my language school used to have before I started teaching was a strike system. They would get a strike each time they used a different language other than English. Now there are just English-only policy posters and specific teachers enforcing it during lunch and break time by giving warnings when they hear something other than English. Wow. Also, as Elizabeth said, my students have also made a rule similar like that for themselves. They say that since they paid to be here, they're here to get as much production practice as possible. Ooh. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I just quickly wanted to respond to Harmony and wanted to highlight how this change or shift can be gradual and soft, right? Because you don't necessarily have to integrate a lot of the L1 into teaching, but you can definitely make your teaching more culturally relevant and draw on some resources that you mentioned, like even Baozi, like mentioning that alone, I think, is empowering and it makes them seen, I think. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Very nice. Derek, you may take the floor.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. All right. I'll lower my hand. So about I would say 8 years ago, or maybe even more, I was tasked with drafting an English-only policy for our school. And at that time, I was being exposed to literature on plurilingualism and multilingual education and so on. And I did not believe that it was the best policy to have for our school. It kind of went against my thinking because I was quite intrigued by all this literature I was reading. But my colleagues and the people who were tasked with drafting this English-only policy were quite adamant and so on. So I did draft a policy, but and they were looking for something like the other person mentioned here, where there's kind of a strike system or there's a penalty, that kind of a thing. Like they really wanted an English-only policy in place. So I changed the name of it. I didn't call it an English-only policy. I called it an English usage policy. And it was just sort of part of my effort to soften it a little bit. And so all I was really able to accomplish in that situation was to just soften it a little bit. So we didn't have a penalty system. We just sort of, I think I outlined some general principles that, if we use English, it's inclusive because it's the one language that everybody understands, including the instructor, and so we're not leaving anybody out, kind of thing. And it's our target language. And I got rid of any kind of punishment or penalty or anything like that. But that's as far as I was able to take it in that situation. I adopt it a little more now. I make a point of greeting all of my students in their first language at the beginning of every day that I see them, and I show an interest in them teaching me. If I don't, because I might not know. I had a Latvian student there a couple terms ago, and I can't remember how to say hello in Latvian now, but just getting them to be the teacher and me the learner, I think that it seems to really work to make a connection with them. And yeah, they enjoy that. And they're, if they're looking up vocabulary, and I allow them to include a definition both in English and in their first language and that kind of thing. But just a few anecdotes from me. So
Thank you, Derek.
Thank you.
We have to move on a little bit. Okay, so conversation and discussion question number 2 is, how do your students or your colleagues respond to English-only policies? So we already touched a little bit on this, but Serikbolsyn or Rebecca, who would like to answer then?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think people have touched on that. Thank you so much for sharing. It's super interesting to hear. Like, I think we've already highlighted so many different reactions, reasons. I think something I've realized too, in some of my research, is by talking with different instructors, there is this sense of responsibility and wanting to prepare learners for the best, outcome possible. And something that people may not think about necessarily is that with that, maybe the goal in mind is that, as we were talking about before, Serikbolsyn, it was about preparing learners for a monolingual workplace or a monolingual classroom, and this just isn't the case anymore, and historically has not been in many societies globally. So that's something that is just so interesting to hear kind of reflected in these different answers. So there are different reactions for the second question of how, you know, your colleagues might react, or Derek's example is fascinating too, of just those dynamics of like one institution but different you know, beliefs, and we're dealing with teacher beliefs and learner beliefs, and then institutional, you know, mandates and marketing strategies, and there's a lot of, you know, different tensions and dynamics there. But yeah, I think something that overall I heard one in a course one time, it always stuck with me, is that if we can sort of reframe, or for me this has worked well, is reframing my responsibility to learners, not to prepare them to use only English, not to erase other languages, or this would be subtractive multilingualism or bilingualism, where home languages, heritage languages are gradually replaced by English or other dominant or hegemonic languages, to use this term. But if we can reframe that belief with the goal for our learners being to become multilingual, we don't want our learners to be multilingual. So then a question becomes, why then would we, you know, teach our learners in monolingual ways? If the goal is not for them to be monolingual people, it's for them to be multilingual, then the classroom becomes a place where, you know, yes, there is a target language, of course, but language education is the goal, and learning that phrase in Latvian can actually maybe help you with being, you know, a competent and you know, English language speaker in different intercultural contexts. So I think that's something that's worked well for me in reframing that. I don't know if that answers the question, but I wanted to throw that out there.
Thank you so much for getting us started with this question. I just wanted to say that, again, like becoming monolingual is such an unattainable goal for our students, right? Because they are multilingual and they need to aim for being able to communicate clearly in English as an additional language, right? That's the goal. And again, there's such a variety of responses to English only policies from colleagues, and it ranges from fully kind of discarding multilingualism as something that needs to be used, from to fully actually encouraging multilingual practices in the classroom and integrating plurilingual teaching practices into their own repertoire, right? Into their own toolbox. So again, teachers can be complacent and can be very proactive in their practices. So there is a range, and I think it depends on what kind of conversations you engage with them, engage in with them. So the change needs to be ecological. That's why I think, as a colleague, I try to talk about all these issues with my colleagues in my community, and it really helps, because sometimes they also think about these issues, but they never really had the courage to actually start implementing something plurilingual, right? Because they thought that it wouldn't be supported by their colleagues. So sometimes just talking about these approaches helps, because you will find people with like similar opinions, and you can like include these practices in the institution, because you can go against the institutional pressure to be monolingual as a community. So yeah.
I just wanted that the chat is heating up a little bit. I wanted to bring you up to date. If you remember, Jenny was talking about the strike system for the students that were not speaking English. And there was is it Asia? I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Responded to that and said, in mine, a university writing center, the pressure is for getting good grades. The EAL students want to have the best oral and written standard academic English possible, as they feel they will get better grades. So that's an interesting point. Harmony says, by the way, regarding the strike system, wouldn't that be getting phased out now or becoming increasingly problematic, given how common such policies were used in colonialist education? Yeah, that's a very interesting point there too. The more we move forward, the more we're behind. Did you want to go to your point, Serikbolsyn? there's a lot of top-down enforcement. Did you want to make that comment,
Oh,
sir?
I was just saying, oh, sorry, one moment. Let me scroll up and see what I said,
Sure.
what I wrote there. Oh, yeah, I was just saying that there's a lot of top-down enforcement of English-only policy because of the institution and its image, right? Because they usually market themselves as EMI or English medium institutions in many contexts, and that's why students even go there to begin with, right? They want to be in this English-only environment because they want to score high in IELTS, TOEFL, and they want to go abroad. And there's a lot of economic value to English only or EMI, and of course all that assessment and tests attract students, and it restrains them at the same time. So it's interesting how students want to be in that restrained environment, right? Because of what people tell them is valuable. So again, it's because of what they were socialized into. And I think that if there is a lot of conversation around plurilingual pedagogies and their value, of course, students will at some point come to appreciation, right? They will appreciate being heard and being valued as people that have other languages, not just English, because otherwise we are erasing all these resources and pretending that they are able to speak only English, right? So yeah, and again, as I said, like teachers don't always have enough power to go against these policies. But again, I think that as teachers, we still have so much agency in our classrooms, and we can enforce or like implement plurilingual pedagogies in some soft ways, you know, that don't necessarily break the rules, right? So yeah, I will stop here.
Super. Back, Harmony and Azy are having this wonderful conversation. You know, you can unmute yourself and speak to each other. It's not a problem. We encourage that here. And at Azy, so Harmony says, I currently teach a first-year humanities course, and some of my students are ESL, EAL, so they also definitely feel that the pressure to just use English. I did end up having to reassure one girl that because she was studying abroad in Canada, it didn't mean that she couldn't use her L1 in her own studying. There's an example looking up a synopsis of a film we're watching beforehand. So hold on a second. Pardon me.
So that she's not overwhelmed by the spoken English, so long as the assignments are written in English.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that.
Okay.
Yeah, so
Harmony,
just to clarify,
yes.
yeah, so the student in question, she's from Turkey. And so it's her first year, right? She's studying abroad. She's just come here to Canada, studying abroad. And I think we had a film that the students are supposed to watch it on their own in advance, and then we would talk about it in class. But then at the beginning of the class, when I had them doing individual work, I noticed she had just broken down crying. And I'm like, what's happening, right? Are you okay? And I took her out into the hallway, and she said that she was just feeling really frustrated. She didn't understand what was happening in the movie and things like that. And it's tricky because it was actually a film that used a multilingual cast. So even like parts of the dialogue might be in other languages, but with English subtitles. But I think she was having a hard time following the parts that were just English only because those did not have subtitles.
Right.
So then I said, look, what you could do in future is, you know, it shouldn't be too hard to go on Google, look up a synopsis of what the film's about, and just try to see if you could go on Turkish Wikipedia and see if you can find that film and find a page about what it's about, and then try and watch it. So once you have the gist of the plot, right, now you can really focus on understanding the dialogue.
Great.
Yeah.
That's great. Shady, did you want to pursue yours as well in the chat? Your point? Shady? No? Actually, my Asian students in EAP programs have majorly interested in English only policy and classes. They explained that they have spent so much time coming to an English-speaking country for complete exposure. That's a good point too. Anyone want to add? It's actually yeah, go ahead, sir. I'm sorry.
I just wanted to respond to what Harmony said earlier and how this student was obviously experiencing like stress and like, I don't know, they were anxious about something, right? So I think that's a very important thing to consider, or that's a big justification for like transitioning to plurilingual pedagogies, because they make students feel safe and empowered to rely on their plurilingual repertoires. And I think that it also needs to make us think that plurilingual pedagogies are not something that's extra work for us. It should be the default, because then everyone will feel included, and it's up to the students to use those resources or not to use them, right? So there should be at least an option to use these resources and to learn in ways that make the learning process equitable, because it's not about asking everyone to rely on English only, and that's the equitable practice, right? So what I'm saying is that they need to have options, and even only then our teaching can be socially just. Yeah. Anything you would like to add, Rebecca?
Yeah, I think that relates also to a bit more to Shadi's comment as well here about like some students wanting to use English, and absolutely, I completely relate to that, as I consider myself a plurilingual person, and there's times when I've definitely wanted to or had to use only one named language. And so I can think of examples where for me and in my own family, I'm usually able to use a combination of Spanish and Italian with my husband and his family, but there's times when I'm speaking with people who wouldn't understand if I, use a phrase in Italian and we're speaking Spanish. So I think part of it is, you said, Serikbolsyn, you said earlier, teacher agency, but also student agency and respecting that choice. I'm also remembering a comment Brian made earlier about, students wanting to, it made me think of how students, it can be very affirming to be spoken to in the target language. If you're, on the other hand, if you're always, trying to say, well, do you need to use other languages? I mean, not that that's what we're trying to say, but I can understand how sometimes it might make a student feel like, oh, is my English not good enough? And of course, that's never something that we want students to feel. Although I've definitely felt that in other languages that I've learned. And I think for myself too, just by adopting more plurilingual perspectives over the years, I can see from like the time when I was learning German as a heritage language, I definitely had the view of like the native speaker, and I wanted, of course, also for like my whole heritage identity, I wanted to sound like them. I wanted to have, that accent, that pronunciation. I worked really, really hard on that. And then as the years went on and I learned and was exposed to more plurilingual ideas, I'm much more, I feel like I can accept myself more in a way that when I'm speaking Italian, for example, and I need to use a phrase in Spanish, I feel like it's okay. And I feel like I can, even if I'm speaking to people who maybe wouldn't know what that Spanish word means, I can still use Italian and I can explain that word. And so those are kind of strategies now that I feel like I can pass on to learners. But going back to the comment in the chat, especially, of course, at higher proficiencies, I feel like definitely your strategies would be different, and student strategies are going to be different as well, in terms of wanting how much they want to engage with target languages, how much they want to refer to the other languages in their repertoire. So I feel like that kind of, respect for language choice. Serikbolsyn said before this word negotiation. So of course, language policy is all about negotiation, and I think that's our whole topic.
Yeah.
It's
just a quick comment in addition to what Rebecca said. I just wanted to highlight and appreciate how you shared your own experience of learning languages. I think that students really, will value hearing about your experiences as a teacher who's learning a language. And I think that I heard from Derek and Brian probably about how they were trying to learn the languages of the students, right? And that alone shows so much. And you are positioning yourself as a learner, and that means a lot to students in many cases. And I think that in my own case, I used to say, when I was learning English, I did this and that. So I was referring to those experiences when I was teaching my students. And that transparency and positioning yourself as a learner instead of an expert that knows everything just means a lot in the context of learning an additional language and making sure that our students are like setting realistic goals, there are limits and things that we need to consider in our context of learning.
Okay, thank you so much. And let's move on to the next question. So our next question is, what opportunities exist to use non-target languages as a resource in your teaching context? That's an interesting one. If nobody has anything, I have something to add.
Yes, please.
Great.
So I teach low-level students, and I found out that, for example, when I'm teaching like harder vocabulary items, instead of just trying to explain that vocabulary item to them, I have a projector. So what I do, I just pull up the Google Translate and I translate that word in Arabic, then I translate it in Nepali, and then I will translate it to all the languages. They will get it right away. And what's good in this, that I don't have to spend as much time on just explaining one or two more complicated words, then I have more time teaching. I don't know if that makes sense to everybody. Yeah. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that I let my students help each other in their languages. So one student is lower and the other one is higher, or one student is brand new, came just today, but the other one was in my class for like months. And then I say something, and instead of that student being stuck, the student in her own language will explain what has to be done, and then we can move on. So in my level 2, it's very useful.
Absolutely. Brenda has her hand up.
Hi, yeah, thanks everyone. This is great conversation. I teach adults, from diverse linguistic backgrounds, and with respect to the last question about opportunities to use the non-target language, when I'm teaching English idioms, I always ask them after we've done one idiom in English if they have something similar in their own language. So it gives them an opportunity to compare, a little bit of cultural exchange. So that's one other way. And I do a lot of the other things that other people are saying. I'm always trying to learn the other person's language and pronounce it a certain way. So get them to teach me. So it sort of evens the power. I mean, there is a lot of power, even though, that we have as instructors, and it gives them a feeling of, I don't know, that they have something to offer as well.
There are lots of good ideas in the chat. So if anybody wants to read it, just read it, and then let's do the breakout rooms now.
And what's the question for the breakout room?
1 second.
Thank you.
Second. It's just in the chat, doing stuff in the chat. Okay. So the breakout room question is, thinking of your teaching context, share a classroom activity that can support the use of non-target languages as a resource.
Okay. Hi, welcome back. Super. Would group 1 like to go first?
I think it was our room, breakout room 1, right?
Yes, it was you. You are correct.
Yeah, like I took some notes, but please, Ken, Nisa, and Vivian, feel free to share what you learned.
Excellent.
Do you want me to summarize what we said or what? Okay, so basically we talked about certain approaches that our instructors have already used in their practice and some things we could possibly do to further move towards plurilingual practices. For example, Ken shared how he uses different languages for instructional or classroom management activities, for example, to pull everyone's attention when they're like doing certain activities, right? And that allows him to bond with his students. And Nisa shared that in her link classes, she did something similar, and that really helps to establish this rapport or personal connection with the students, right? And currently in the EAP program where she teaches mostly Chinese students, she tries to apply the same strategy, but the students seem resistant to plurilingual approaches to teaching, unfortunately. And we were brainstorming what we could possibly do in such cases. And Vivian shared her very interesting approach to raising students' metalinguistic awareness by drawing on some knowledge of grammar in the students' L1. So there's some comparative pedagogy, basically. So by showing some similarities and differences in the languages in the classroom, she uses some plurilingual approaches to teaching. And I also shared some ideas that could complement what our instructors already do, such as asking the students to share their strategies of using L1 for learning English, because I think it's really useful to position ourselves as learners when we teach, right? And then we could share those strategies with everyone, because just because one student does it doesn't mean that others know how to apply such strategies, right? And by dialogically learning from each other, we can strengthen the development of their English as an additional language. And again, we can softly introduce the plurilingual strategies in case the students are resistant, because we are the experts as teachers, right? Although we need to be dialogic, we still need to firmly stand on our position, I don't know, on certain things, and we can show the values of L1 or languages other than English by engaging in discussions related to social justice in general, for example, about the impact of English as a colonial language in the context of Canada, by talking about Indigenous languages and land acknowledgement. I think that those things might possibly make the students a bit more considerate of plurilingual approaches. Yeah, that's all. I will stop here. Thank you so much for our team, Ken, Nisa, Vivian. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Oh, how nice. Thank you. Anyone else?
Oh, Elizabeth is gonna go. Yeah.
No, that's okay. I can't remember. I think my group was group 3. Maybe it was group 2. From what I got, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think that Asia, there's not much use of the non-target language. So I can't remember if you mentioned an activity, but please feel free to speak. And then Clarissa said that there's a vocabulary picture book or translation is used.
Mm-hmm.
For myself, just because we ran out of time, I teach learners who actually are natively French speaking. They work for the federal government of Canada, and we have a methodology and online language learning program where it is translated already to French for them. So, but I hear a lot from my learners that they don't want to do the translation from French to English too much, because then they're not thinking in English. They want to practice thinking in English. But as somebody mentioned in the chat, I try to ask them what kind of idioms, if we're talking about idioms, do you have this idiom in your language? And then they translate that for me, or they'll look at the translation that is there and say, oh, that's actually not correct. I don't say that one, because there's different ways to say different things in different languages, or if it's a particular kind of French, like a Quebec versus France French. So that's the kind of thing that I do. Yeah. Just little things.
It's really good. Interesting.
I think those little things really do, make a big difference, not to sound cheesy, but yeah, our group also mentioned a few kind of little things, but I also want to throw out some final terms, because we did mention a lot of plurilingual theory, but I think it's nice to kind of connect that with the practices that we just talked about. So one of them was Brian had mentioned, I think before as well, about just using French and English and to make meaning together. So if English isn't working and English only isn't working, draw on French as much as you can or need to or want to. And so this Serikbolsyn has more expertise in this area, but for me, this is a practice of translanguaging as well, moving kind of dynamically across different languages and different resources. One other thing that Harmony started to mention as well is kind of a technique or strategy of analyzing, if learners are maybe making an error, especially an error that might cause affect mutual understanding. It might cause a misunderstanding, those sorts of errors with vocabulary, for example, that teachers can find ways to just attend to that and make a teaching point out of that. So if you notice, okay, this means something else in maybe a learner's L1, and in English it means that. Paying attention to that could be helpful. And to give you another term here, in the theory, so intercomprehension is maybe the basis of this. And I really, so my one example as well deals with intercomprehension. So basically, the way I understand intercomprehension is, if I, know some French, I probably understand some Spanish. Some of you may not realize it, but just by knowing English, you actually probably know some Romanian. So I'm going to copy what the example that I shared. Karolina, I think, knows Romanian, but this may not be, this is from Google Translate. I'm going to be very honest. But this could be something to do with even, learners at any level. But I would put a sentence like this. I'm not going to read it. I'm sorry. But
I can read it if you want.
Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, do you want to?
Economia politică internațională. Just one second, it just popped away. Ok, economia politică internațională este o criză dificilă. I could translate it in Spanish probably, but I don't speak Spanish.
Oh yeah, well, and I don't, and if no one here speaks Spanish or Romanian or French or another Romance language, even with English, Elizabeth, you understand it?
It
right?
looks like Spanish, Portuguese, but I noticed it was Romanian because of the accents.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
Sure, but even from English, we probably recognize like economy, politic, international, crisis, difficult. So that's just one strategy that, again, even for like language beginner learners of English, I did this once with speakers that of Spanish and Portuguese, and I chose on purpose, cognates, so words that I knew would have some, relevance to them, they could recognize. So that's I don't know if this has a name, but I would call it an intercomprehension sort of strategy. And yeah, as Harmony, do you want to share your example you wrote in the chat? But
yeah, so it's interesting. This is not a English related example, but if anyone goes to an Asian supermarket, you'll find there are a lot of products where the labels are still written in Japanese, as an example. Now, no one in my family actually speaks or reads Japanese or understands it, but what happens is because part of Japan, the Japanese writing system uses kanji, uses Chinese characters. So what my parents will do is they will just, in that whole label, just pick out the Chinese characters that there are and sort of kind of guess at what it means.
Brilliant.
And we sort of, I don't know, none of us know if we're actually doing it correctly, but hey, right?
That's
there
brilliant. I love that.
Just a little thing about what Rebecca said. I just remembered something, like, how important it is to let them sometimes go back to their first languages. I have many Arabic students, and they say, oh, I have a car red. And then I couldn't figure out why they say car red. And then it turned out in Arabic, it's car red, but when you translate it, it's red car. So now they know that, okay, in English is red car, but in your language is car red. So like these things, then they will remember, because, oh, okay, so it's not the same as in my language, it's the other way around. So it helps.
Like errors, but also for, transfer, like positive, I guess, transfer into English. So, or any other language. Like I was talking with someone from Brazil and using some Spanish to practice my Portuguese. And I was just asking, like, oh, so the verbs, is that what Portuguese does as well? And so that's a way to say, like, to automatically transfer so much that I already know for my Portuguese, and students can do for English or other languages they're learning. So, but I think it works both ways, which is
super
great.
Okay, we are
Thank you
getting
so much.
close. So
Any other groups? Yes.
Oh, did
Well, we were group 2. We lost a member, but we mentioned one of the things we mentioned was having colingual groups get together, people, students who share a first language get together, and if we're having some topic to discuss, to have them to discuss it in the first language, to really, well, the purpose would be to have them to be able to dig in a little deeper. in a more sophisticated way, probably, than if it was English only. And then once they've done that, then they can return to English, and they've just got a richer sort of exchange of ideas then after that.
That's so good for the soul too. It really is.
Thank you everyone for participating. I think this was a very interesting topic, and thank you for our subject matter experts. It was a really nice topic to talk about, and I think we could still talk for 2 more hours if you had the time. So thank you, Rebecca and Serikbolsyn.
Yes, stay in touch.
So if you want to get in touch with them, that's their email address, and also they are on linked.
Thank you all again.
Thank you.
To everyone. Thank you so much. Keep
Thank
well.
you.
Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Hanukkah, anything
Thank you.
in between. Happy New
Thank
Year.
you.